Welcome back to We Play Games. I'm Walker, and here we are in Crusader Kings 3 After the End lore, about to discuss A Land of Giants. So I want to preface this that there isn't an official bookmark yet for this area of the map, and this may end up being called a different thing, but I think that that title captures at least the flavor that's here in the game. So for those of you who are avid fans of history, you'll remember that Magellan did that famous circumnavigation, or at least his crew did the famous circumnavigation of the globe, and they came past the southern tip of South America, north of Tierra del Fuego, and south of this area which they, the Spaniards, then named Patagonia. That's because they kind of erroneously believed the people living there were Patagon, were these giant people, and I think that that land of giants mythology is still present here in the Southern Cone, in the same sort of way that it's present in the psyche in North America, right? There is a perception, especially amongst the Americanists and the Galvanists, any sort of Anachronous faith, to ascribe indirectly to the very concept of a great person hypothesis when it comes to the structure of history. So very briefly, before we discuss the Pampa, because I do want to discuss the terrain here, because it just is super important in the Tawantinsuyu Empire in the Clouds bookmark. The terrain here in A Land of Giants is incredibly important, but I do want to frame this for all of you, the concept of the great person hypothesis. So it's one of these, it's not really a specific scientific hypothesis, rather it's a narrative device employed by historians, especially 19th and 20th century historians, to try to help people understand the motive forces that created historical change. So you might be familiar with the concept of the Hegelian dialectic, which is like the interplay between thesis and antithesis and the conflict between two different ideas producing a synthesis, which is, of course, like all of these things are a 19th century white dude just having ideas and not testing them and just saying they're perfect, fine, go with it. But that doesn't make it less useful as a way of assessing the psychic power of history when it comes to humans. Because of course humans have a draw to magical charisma, right? We can joke around as much as we want, but cults of personality exist in real life, and they exist in real life because whether or not the great person hypothesis is accurate, humans have an easier time identifying with other humans than they do with non-anthropomorphized magical historical forces. And that very broad concept is actually distilled here in these Anachronous faiths. And of course, because this is Argentina and not the United States, the characters who are going to be important, the people who are going to be venerated in these Anachronous faiths here, are going to be entirely different. Because of course they are, right? You're not going to be worshiping Washington down here. But there's also another force at work here, which is the force of terrain. This is the Pampa. The Pampa is this wide open plain, extremely fertile, flat lowlands centered around the Rio de la Plata. We have Uruguay over here, we have Argentina, we have the southernmost province of Brazil, but this is an incredibly productive agricultural territory, and it's incredibly productive for livestock as well. And it's productive for livestock in a way that I think would obviously maintain in any sort of post-apocalyptic society. Not only because there are lots of cattle there now, unless the event somehow wiped out livestock, it's not hard to understand how large populations of livestock could grow all over the place and basically create pasturage for themselves. But nomadic pastoralists make a lot of sense in these sort of flat open spaces, right? Think about the Central Asian steppes. And that's kind of what was going on here in the 19th century. This is where the caudillos had their armies, because they were mobile, they had access to horses, and they were difficult to pin down because they didn't have the same sort of settled fortifications that you could conquer in a war. And of course, everyone is going to be getting way more access to protein, way more access to calcium. There's way more meat to go around. And so the people in any sort of nomadic pastoralist society, really up until the early Middle Ages, typically had better nutritional outcomes than people living in settled locations throughout most of the world, which is another really fancy way of saying that here in A Land of Giants, we may have actual giants. For those of you who know like way too much history of Patagonia, I'm sure you can tell me who, but I believe that there's an operating thesis that the people that Magellan saw here in Patagonia were of a specific tribe that we've found remains of, who actually were 6 inches or taller on average than the average European at the time. And that can be due to genetic impact, but it absolutely can also be due to nutritional impact. And that's important to keep in mind here. Well, that's I think enough framing when it comes to a land of giants. Let's talk about the giants themselves. Let's talk first about the faiths, because I think the faiths are going to be the ones that are going to most clearly demonstrate the power of a magical person. So I know I said that we're done with the historical context, but I lied to you. We're never done with the historical context, especially because here, a lot of these faiths are going to be very explicitly calling into account the historical context of the people living in this area and the things that would have been spiritually important to them. And I think that the things that the mod team says are spiritually going to be important around here are national symbols. And I think that that makes sense. So for those of you who are like super duper unfamiliar with 19th and 20th century history in Argentina, I don't blame you. There's a saying about Argentina, which is that Argentinians are from boats. Because they really are a country built by immigrants. There were a large number of Italians and Germans who migrated to Argentina over the course of the 19th century. And whenever you have a large migrant population, forming a national identity is always complicated. And one of the things, of course, that people usually turn to under those circumstances are important historical figures. And there was an important historical figure in 1986, Maradona. In the 1980s, Argentina had a brutal military dictatorship that engaged in the dirty war where they were kidnapping and executing enemies of the state or enemies of the United States. But they decided in 1982 that they were going to invade the Falklands because they needed a way to gin up support for the military, and winning a war against the United Kingdom was viewed as a really easy way to build legitimacy locally. And so they invaded the Falkland Islands, but Maggie Thatcher fought back and inflicted upon Argentina more a psychological defeat than anything else. And it was an important psychological defeat. And I think that the evidence there is the way that the population reacted to the 1986 defeat of the UK by especially Maradona. So in the 1986 FIFA World Cup, Argentina played against the UK, and Maradona, one of the best Argentinian footballers, probably one of the best footballers in the world, scored 2 goals. He scored the Hand of God goal, and he scored the goal of the century. And controversially, of course, the Hand of God goal turned out it was more than just a little bit of the hand of God and the head of Maradona. It was more the hand of Maradona and the hand of Maradona. But the country went wild when Argentina defeated the UK. And that concept here in Federalista, this Platinian faith chosen by the hand, is going to be a trait that's going to be virtuous to Federalistas, available through this tenant. And it's not even restricted to Federalista. It also is present here in Vendimia Sol. They may or may not have different characters. I don't know yet. Some of this lore, I'm sure, is being written right now by the mod team, but it's too much fun to not talk about. And of course, it's here in the Unitario. But this unifying tenet tells us that the people who live here in a land of giants do believe, at least a large number of them, believe in the magical power of specific people, of specific magical charismatic people. I think that captures the feeling of a melting pot society very well, right? They would need specific unifying characters to hold them together in the event of an apocalypse, because of the way that they are actually from, at least originally, a complex network of countries. Of course, not all faiths are going to be quite as obsessed with the founders. Confederal, for instance, is another Anachronous Platinian faith, but does not have the Hand of God. And in fact, this emphasizes the concept of a pluralistic, democratic movement of power over a great person hypothesis. And that's reflected in the virtues that are important to being a confederal. Not that, like, I'm a total shill for any religion that has peasant leader as a virtue, but, like, that's the real spice. That's the good stuff. And here we even have a religion that although it doesn't directly reference the concept of giant Patagonians down here, it does reference the concept of a great society existing prior to the event, an Atlantean society. We also have two Catholic churches here. We have the Animist Catholic Church and the Particularist Catholic Church, who are indirectly in conflict with one another. The Animist Catholic Church leaning more heavily into the concept of the synchronization of spirits and saints, but with the struggle between these churches being primarily one more about power than about religious teachings. But in either case, Catholicism itself indirectly ascribes to the great person thesis when it comes to history by emphasizing saints as an intercessory vehicle. They're specifically telling you that the important people are important spiritually. There are some people who are kind of on the outside, for instance, the Gauchata, but I think the Gauchata, much like the Farapia, are going to be, in my mind at least, literally giant people. Because I personally believe that these guys are going to be getting 400 calories more a day and 15 extra grams of protein. And I'm really looking forward to playing around with especially these nomadic realms, because we don't have nomads in vanilla CK3, and I love nomads. They're so much fun. You get to raid people and smash stuff. And that's, I think, a great gameplay loop. And so I'm really looking forward to playing with High King Enrico or with Queen Ana Maria and seeing how these people who are not themselves settled but do have a very complex society are operating. Because nomadic pastoralists are not hunter-gatherers. These are complex societies with hierarchies and laws that are meant to govern larger populations, but typically without settled locations that they have to govern long term. And that's sort of what's going to be going on here in Crusader Kings 3. These nomadic realms, they never settle in one place, but keep moving in search of food and other resources. So you have access to some special casus belli, migration, grand raids, but each of them in turn emphasizing struggle and conflict, because struggle and conflict is going to be kind of a background force for a lot of these people. Nomadic pastoralists have to move because they are extremely efficient. They will eventually deplete that farmland, so you gotta move. And movement, it's not free in this world. When it comes to cultures here in A Land of Giants, there's some really fun cultural traditions, like Gaucho Legacy, for instance, gives all of these cultures access to a really powerful light cavalry unit, but also mercenary soccer, cosmopolitan elitism, which, to reiterate, of course, anywhere in this post-apocalyptic setting that you have a giant urban center, that's going to have an impact on the people living there because they don't have farmland, right? If there's concrete on the ground, you can't farm there. And so you have to come up with different ways to use that land. But because there's so many resources in those massive urban centers, it would be foolish to not try to utilize that space, right? If you need steel in this post-apocalyptic society, if there's a skyscraper, you mine it. Most of the work's been done for you. And so people would naturally be attracted to these massive urban centers, but those massive urban centers are going to have a massive impact on the sorts of economies and societies that could exist locally. And that's why we see the cosmopolitan elitism just show up basically anywhere there's a metropolis in-game, including in South America. But there are a couple of other really fun, important characters here in A Land of Giants. For instance, Libertador Horacio, who is the head of faith for the Unitario faith, and looks like going to be a very strong military character, chosen by the Hand. Of course, because this is a Hand of God faith with pursuit of power, a really great candidate to either conquer all of the area or conquer it and push back against the nomads, if you are so motivated. One of the characters that kind of sneaks by, though, if you only look at the Faiths page, is this character here, King Saul of the Nasir Kingdom, who is himself a Muslim following the Shiite school. I'm kind of curious to hear from the devs if they think this is a 5er or a 7er or a 12er derived Shiite faith. It doesn't really matter. It's mostly an academic question. They are Shiites, and they are present here in Argentina even today. They're, of course, Muslims all throughout the Americas, but this is a fairly small minority that has taken control of this territory locally. But if you wanted like a real challenge, then playing as King Saul looks like it would be a lot of fun, because you are surrounded basically on all sides by enemies. And unfortunately, unlike our friends the Nomads, King Saul does not have access to raiding. To bring the video full circle, here we'll end with a brief conversation about Patagonic faiths and the Chon faiths. So here we have the Caliphatist faith, which is a Patagonic faith. It's a folkloric faith, but it's one that I think references something interesting about Patagonia, which is that it's cold, right? When most people think about the southern hemisphere, they imagine it as being particularly warm, unless they've been there, unless they understand the way seasons work. So here, around the equator, of course, you have fewer seasons, and it's generally always going to get more sun. But the reason that we get seasons is because the Earth is tilted on its axis, and so as it rotates around the sun and wobbles, you get more or less sun during particular times of year. But down here in Tierra del Fuego and Patagonia, they do experience winter. The average temperature in Tierra del Fuego during winter in July, August is 34 degrees. That's not Russia, Siberia cold, due largely to the presence of the Pacific Ocean, but it is very dry. And I think that pretty clearly the Caliphatist faith seems to reference the possibility of climate change as either a vehicle for the event, a consequence of the event, or an imagination of the event by the survivors of it. Because climate change has affected these areas before, right? During the Ice Age, these areas would have been way, way, way colder due to their presence close to Antarctica, and that powerful anticyclone pulling up cold air. And so, of course, if it was 15 to 20 degrees colder down there, these areas would be a lot harder to survive in. That's more fanon than it is anything specifically in the mod. The faith itself does very clearly spell out the concept of cold in Patagonia in a way that I think if you're entirely unfamiliar with South America, you wouldn't even think of. And of course we have the Chon, another Amerindian faith that I think we've talked a lot about why indigenous faiths should do well in a post-apocalyptic society, but it's largely because the people who would ascribe to those faiths would probably be themselves indigenous, and indigenous people are largely going to have better social structures to survive apocalypses. Is that the plural of apocalypse? I find myself asking that more and more. If you want to understand why indigenous people would do really well in a post-apocalypse, then I would reference my Ghosts of the North video, because we talk about it there. But yeah, that's Walker. That's a Land of Giants. There's a very, very good chance that the mod team ends up coming up with an entirely different name, but I wanted to talk about the lore here because it's fun. I am having stability issues with Open Beta 5, so I'm gonna have to switch back to Open Beta 1 for recording the episodes with Martine, but we're gonna play in South America this week, I promise. I just need to find something that works, and Open Beta 1 did work pretty well once I got it loaded, but oh my god. If I get a consistent, stable release out of the devs, I'll do an 8-hour stream. I promise. All right, that's Walker. Take care.